Hi, everybody. This is Gina Bauer, and the nation that I chose is Romania. So I chose Romania, but I think it is a country that's often forgotten, even though it's played an important part in modern history. I wanted to research and learn more about the country and the events that have happened in the last century. So let's start with a little bit of background on Romania. Romania was founded relatively recently in 1878. The capital of Romania is Bucharest. The population is 19.7 million. It is neighbor to Bulgaria, Serbia, and Hungary. Many of you are familiar with the novel and multiple movies of Dracula. Bram Stoker based his novel Dracula on the 15th century Wallabian prince, Vlad Dracul of Romania, also more affectionately known as Vlad the Impaler. If you look to the left, you'll see a photo of Vlad Dracul's castle in the Transylvania woods of Romania. A little creepy, but still pretty cool. I also thought it was a pretty neat fact that Romanian gypsies make up about 3% of the population. So let's talk about the Warsaw Pact. I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with or have heard about NATO. What the Warsaw Pact was, it was basically the Soviet Union's version of NATO. So in 1955, Romania, the Soviet Union, Albania, Bulgaria, the German Democratic Republic, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, and Poland signed the Warsaw Pact, which was a collective defense treaty created as a counterbalance to NATO. The purpose of the Warsaw Pact, much like NATO, was to be a collective defense. This meant that if one nation was attacked by outside forces, then the rest of the countries would come to its defense. So it's basically like, if you make fun of my little sister, I'm going to come beat you up. The Warsaw Pact was also speculated to have been used by the Soviet Union to preserve their military control in the other neighboring countries. The Warsaw Pact was eventually dissolved in 1991. If you look at the image to the right, this shows the Warsaw Pact, the founders, and the nations that joined in up until 1990. So as you can see, in dark red is the USSR, and lighter red is the original founders of the Warsaw Pact. Next to it are nations that joined a little bit later, between 1965 and 84, Yugoslavia, Finland, Sweden, and Austria, and then the other nations that joined as the years went on. So let's talk about Nicolae Stoico. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing that right, but I'm doing my best. So who is Nicolae Stoico? He was a Romanian communist politician. He was the head of the state from 1967 until 1974, when he came into power of the President of the Republic of Romania, which he held until 1989. Stoico and his secret police force, the Secretariat, enforced control over free speech and would not allow anyone, especially the media, to disagree or oppose him and his rules. In typical communist fashion, Stoico sought to control freedom of choice. One example I would like to give would be his issuing of Decree 770 in 1966. This decree prohibited the use of contraception and the right to an abortion. This caused maternal mortality rates to surge as women used illegal means to terminate their pregnancy. In 1982, with an economic deficit looming, Stoico had much of Romania's agricultural and industrial yield exported, which resulted in a drastic scarcity of food, fuel, medicines, and other daily necessities. If you look to the right, there is a photo of Nicolae Stoico and his wife Elena. Stoico also promoted members of his own family to government office. For instance, he promoted Elena to various levels of senior government, eventually moving to the role of deputy prime minister. Does this remind you of anyone? So let's talk about the fall of Stoico and the Romanian Revolution. The Romanian Revolution was more widely known as the Bloody Revolution, and it was a time of brutal civil disorder in the December of 1989. So many Romanians were tired of the social and economic difficulties that they and their country faced daily, thanks to Stoico's poor governmental decisions. Anti-government protests began on December 17, 1989, in the city of Timisoara. Again, pardon my pronunciation. Tear gas, tanks, and ammunition were used by the army against the protesting crowd, which resulted in many civilian casualties. On December 19th in Bucharest, Susaku gave a televised speech to a large crowd. This speech ultimately resulted in another violent protest, where 13 people were killed, again with the army using violent force against the gathered civilians. On December 22nd, 1989, Nicolae Susaku tried again to address the crowd from a balcony, but is forced to retreat when the crowd refuses to be silent. Susaku and his wife flee Bucharest. He's captured a day later and is brought back to Bucharest. On Christmas Day, December 25th, Susaku and his wife Elena are charged with genocide, specifically for the murder of civilians during the protests in Timisoara, and they sit through a very short trial. It was more like a show trial. It was that quick. The Susakus were quickly found to be guilty, and then they were executed via firing squad right after the trial. This trial and execution essentially brought the Romanian Revolution to a close. If you look to the right, some of my primary sources are up top. That is a photo of protesters in Bucharest. They are sitting on an army tank. Below is a newspaper article regarding the bloodbath in Bucharest and how there was a ruthless use of armed force. So this is Nicolae Susaku's final speech. You can actually find the televised speech on YouTube. So what he did, he gave a nationally televised speech before a crowd in Bucharest during the protests. This was an annual speech, but they kind of amped it up a little bit. Workers were bussed in under threat of being fired to wave flags and hold pictures of Susaku and his wife, essentially saying that they were on his side. They agreed with what he was saying. The crowd of around 80,000 people was told by the army when to applaud, when to stand, when to sing. However, during Susaku's speech, people in the crowd started chanting Timisoara, which was in response to the civilians killed during the protest there. Susaku, as you can see right here, he raised his hand to try and regain control of the crowd. However, they wouldn't be quiet. They kept shouting, they kept chanting, and many people left the square. He realized then that these people were no longer under his control. He was eventually removed from the balcony. And it's interesting to think, looking at him now, that this man and his wife, in just a couple days, were going to be executed. So what are some of the challenges of modern Romanians? The picture you see behind is a picture of protests in Bucharest. In 2017, Romania saw protests that rivaled the size of the Susaku descent. So here there are about 150,000 people protesting. What were they protesting? So the protests were the country's response to a decree that decriminalized exploitation in office by government officials. The decree would have essentially put a halt to all investigations on corruption crimes and allowed officials in prison for corruption to walk free. So basically, there was a decree by the government saying that these corrupt officials, it's okay, like they may have committed legitimate crimes, we're going to let them go. People weren't having that. The protest lasted 6 days, and it did effectively stop the decree from being issued. However, the protests continued. So, in conclusion, Romania has been through quite a lot in the past 70 years. From the fall of communism to the assassination of the president, citizens of Romania have had to deal with constant change. However, it looks like the younger generation of Romanians are following in their forefathers' footsteps by continuing to protest against corrupt government leaders and policies. This is just a list of my references. I had a really great time finding the primary sources for this project. It really makes you feel like you're there and you're kind of living it through pictures, which is really interesting. So thank you very much for sitting through this with me, and I hope you learned something like I did.